Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no.
Are there other senators wishing to vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 46, the nays are 54. The motion to adjourn is not agreed to. The Majority Leader.
Are we now on the motion to reconsider the Millett nomination?
We are. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt.
Okay, all right.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer.
And these will be after this vote?
Mr. Brown.
After this, we're on the closer to what, 300
After this,
No, after this, we're on.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
Feel the roll in the chair.
Yeah.
And then those three.
Mr. Cardin.
And then we vote.
Mr. Carper.
Make sure of that.
Get back.
Point of order, please. I make a point of order not
Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz.
Right. I've got 9 gone.
Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin.
Yeah, he needs to make his point of order.
Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
We only have children and children.
Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee.
We gotta stand up.
Okay, so
I mean, they don't pronounce
we can make the point of order before
You got it.
make the point of order. We will not sustain it. We will
All right, so I'll see you down there. Thank you.
We'll have the vote on it. Then we will have inquiry. Oh, okay. He will make.
His inquiry is coming.
All right.
I know, it's a little different.
All right.
Mr. Levin.
Yeah, yeah. Point of order. Ruling.
Secretary, how do you place
Appeal.
Mr. Manchin.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, ma'am.
Vote.
Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain.
Point of order.
Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico,
I don't know which ones they'll be, but I have answers to all of them.
Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Boxer. Blumenthal? Got it. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden.
McDonough.
Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin.
Could we have order so the clerk can be heard?
Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin, Baucus, Bekich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson, South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Udall, Colorado, Udall, New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Hoven. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Blake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Kirk, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Bitter, and Wicker. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Crapo, no.
Yes. You want to use this?
Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. McCain, no.
The other senators wishing to vote. If not, by a vote of 57 ayes and 43 nays, the motion to reconsider the motion and vote cloture on the nomination of Patricia Millett is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I raise a point of order that the vote on cloture under Rule 22 for all nominations other than that for Supreme Court of the United States is by majority vote.
Under the rules, the point of order is not sustained.
I appeal the ruling. The chair and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second?
Mr. President, parliamentary inquiry.
The Republican leader will state the parliamentary inquiry.
Is it correct that under the bipartisan provisions of S.Res. 15 adopted earlier this year, that post-cloture debate time on a district court nomination is limited to 2 hours before an up or down vote is required under the rules?
Pursuant to S.Res. 15 of the 113th Congress, post-cloture debate on district court nominees is limited to 2 hours.
Further parliamentary inquiry, Mr.
The senator will state it.
Is it correct that under the bipartisan provisions of S.Res. 15 adopted earlier this very year, that post-cloture debate time on any executive branch nomination other than those at the cabinet level is already limited to 8 hours before an up or down vote is required under Senate rules?
Pursuant to S.Res. 15 of the 113th Congress, post-cloture debate on any nomination to the executive branch, which is not a Level 1 position, as set forth in Title V, United States Code, Section 5312, is limited to 8 hours.
Nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
I'm sorry,
one other parliamentary inquiry. When the Senate's rules were amended and a new standing order on consideration of nominations was established earlier this year, the Majority Leader and I engaged in a colloquy to announce that no further rules changes would be considered unless under the regular order and through the action of the Senate Rules Committee. Would the Chair confirm that currently the rules of the Senate provide that a proposal to change the Senate rules would be fully debatable unless 2/3 of the senators present and voting voted to invoke cloture, which would mean 67 senators voting in the affirmative if all 100 voted?
The Republican leader is correct.
Further inquiry, it's my understanding that prevailing on an appeal of the ruling of the Chair would change Senate precedent on how nominations are considered in the Senate and effectively change the procedures of application of the Senate rules. How many votes are required to appeal the ruling of the Chair in this instance?
A simple majority of those senators present and voting is required.
So I'm correct that overturning the ruling of the Chair requires a simple majority vote?
The senator from Kentucky is correct. The Majority Leader has appealed from the decision of the Chair. The question is, shall the decision of the Chair stand as the judgment of the Senate? Yeas and nays are requested. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran.
It's easy to research the staying, not the staying. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich.
Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Leahy.
I'll vote for him, no. Lady, no. I'm no. You still get a vote, sir.
I said no.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Markley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, Levin, Manchin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Pryor, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Bitter, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Donnelly, no. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye.
The Senate will be in order. The Senate will be in order. Are there other senators who wish to vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 48, the nays are 52. The decision of the chair is not sustained. The Republican leader.
Mr. President, I make a point of order that nominations are fully debatable under the rules of the Senate unless 3/5 of senators chosen and sworn have voted to bring debate to a close. Under the precedent just set by the Senate, cloture is invoked at a majority. Therefore, I appeal the ruling of the chair and ask for the ayes and nays.
The chair has not yet ruled. So under the precedent set by the Senate today, November 21st, 2013, the threshold for cloture on nominations, not including those to the Supreme Court of the United States, is now a majority. That is the ruling of the chair.
I appeal the ruling and ask for the ayes and nays.
The Republican leader appeals from the decision of the chair. The question is now, shall the decision of the chair stand as the judgment of the Senate?
Ask for the ayes.
The ayes and nays requested. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The ayes and nays are ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte.
You vote with you.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett.
Okay, so I voted aye, right? Simon doesn't want you to speak over here. You vote me aye. I'm leaving the chair.
Taking over, Tammy.
Sanders, aye.
You know, when you're late, he's
I got you.
can't sit
Warner.
in place.
No, Bernie and I got to meet some people out front. So you have me as aye?
Yes. Yes. Mr. Bennett. Did he answer me? Did he answer? Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates.
Thank you.
That's the regular motion.
Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons.
I have the response, so I figured that was
Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donley. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. King. Mr. King.
Have I voted?
No, but you don't count. Just trying to help you out. Yes, sir.
But thank you.
Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Yes, sir.
Right on top of it. Thank you, Don.
Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, and Wyden. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Blake, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hoban, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson, Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, Levin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Pryor, Rubio, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Risch, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Corker, No. Mr. Menendez? Aye.
The Senate will be in order. The Senate will be in order on this vote. The yeas are 52, the nays are 40.